Well, good morning, and welcome to a panel on reducing the cost of antimicrobial resistance. I'm Allan Coukell with the Pew Charitable Trusts. The World Health Organization has identified antimicrobial resistance as one of the top public health priorities of 2019. And since this is the future of the Health Summit, I thought I would kick us off with your permission by actually taking us briefly back into the past. So this is actually from a physician memoir from 1937. And he was working in Boston and on the wards of Boston City Hospital. And he wrote, "For most of the infectious diseases on the wards of Boston City Hospital in 1937, there was nothing that could be done beyond bed rest and nursing care." This is from Lewis Thomas, who would go on to be a Lasker Award winner, a very esteemed physician. He said, "I remember the astonishment when the first cases of sepsis were treated with antibiotics in 1937. The phenomenon was almost beyond belief. Here were moribund patients who would surely have died without treatment, improving within a matter of hours and feeling entirely well within the next day. We became convinced overnight that nothing lay beyond our reach for the future. Medicine was off and running. And for 70, 80 years, we've sort of taken antibiotics for granted. But the reason we're talking about them now is we can't take them for granted anymore. Resistant infections are increasingly common. And as we'll talk about today, there are fewer and fewer companies in the business of developing antibiotics. And so our topic for today is, how do we address this problem? And you can use a sort of fossil fuels analogy, where you both have to reduce consumption of the existing resource and ensure that we're generating sort of new fuel, new treatments for the future. Our focus today is really on that latter part. Where do we generate? How do we create an ecosystem that generates new therapeutics? And I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel that brings really diverse perspectives to this conversation. Their detailed bios are available to you. I'm just going to introduce them briefly, beginning on my immediate left with Ella Balassa from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. And Ella, this is an issue that has a personal meaning for you. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So antibiotic resistance is single-handedly the greatest threat to vulnerable populations like those with cystic fibrosis, where bacterial infections are the hallmark of the disease. And not just in people with CF, but in the general population, those unfortunate enough to contract some kind of bacterial-resistant infections, the need for...
We're having interference on your mic. All right. Sorry. The need for new antibiotics is really, is an unmet need. And so, personally, I have dealt with antibiotic-resistant infections through the course of my life, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. I've required using antibiotics, and those with CF require using a lot of antibiotics for nearly constantly, both oral and intravenous form. This past winter, I became very ill I contracted a viral infection along with the normal infections that I have in my lungs because of CF. And compounded, I was on intravenous colistin, and which is one of the strongest antibiotics in our arsenal today, and intravenous Vabomere, which isn't even intended for a respiratory indication. But after 5 weeks on these treatments, I was having no relief in my symptoms at all. And that's when I knew I needed to resort to some kind of alternative therapy and a novel therapy. And that's when I tried phage therapy. And for those that are unaware, it's using a virus to attack a very specific bacterial host. And I can talk about this more later, but if I wouldn't have tried this therapy, traditional antibiotics would not have eliminated the infection, the exacerbation of the infection that I was facing. And so there is a need for developing novel approaches for antimicrobial resistance. If we're just creating more traditional antibiotics, we're just kind of kicking the can down the road. The rate of resistance is not going to be decreasing. And so I urge for focus on, bacteria have an uncanny ability to resist antibiotics. And so developing these new kinds of approaches where pharmaceutical companies can be using these new treatments for longer periods of time, and without the fear or without the possibility for resistance where their products can't be used after certain periods of time. So I hope we can discuss that further.
Great, thanks, Ellen. There's a lot to pick up there, and one of the things you mentioned, along with sort of sharing your personal experience, which I think is so important, is non-traditional therapeutics. So we will come back to that in the hour, but let's stay focused for now just on the kind of traditional, what we call small molecule antibiotic space, the sort of traditional drug space. Janelle Krishnamurthy is Associate Vice President of Global Policy and Population Health for Merck. Merck has been in the antibiotics business since the very beginning, one of the few big pharmas still in the business. But Janelle, what's the pharma perspective on the antibiotics business right now?
Unfortunately, we're kind of one of the lone companies out there, and this is an area where we need more. We need to bring in more at all the different levels. And I think, Allan, you bring up a good point. If you're just looking at the business case of this, right? You have to decide, am I going to put money into research and development on antibiotics or in other different therapeutic areas, and recognize your return on investment is going to be very different on those other areas. However, to your point at the beginning, Merck has been in this area for 80 years, so we developed penicillin. So in addition to the antibiotic development, we also are doing vaccines for prevention to try to prevent the diseases. But this is something we look at as a public health crisis and something that we're dedicated and committed to making a difference in, but we can't do it alone. And we really are engaged with many stakeholders here in the panel and globally to try to fix some of the issues and obstacles we'll discuss later, I'm sure, of why it has dwindled to just a few pharmaceutical companies that are engaged in this, and also how many of the small biotechs and smaller VCs have not been able to flourish in this area.
Well, let me ask you just a sort of quick follow-up on that, because a couple of years ago we saw another infectious disease drug for hepatitis C sell $11 billion in a very short period of time. A new cancer drug can be $30,000 or more, much more, for a course of treatment.
That's right.
So when you as a company are deciding how to allocate capital, how do antibiotics look?
It is a continual, if it was just a business case that Merck was making, I don't think that would be, the decision where they would be deciding to continue to allocate capital in this. It is a holistic and a historical reason why we are committed to this field. So, if you were just looking at the return on investment and all the other therapeutics you could invest in, this isn't the one that rises to the top. We continue in this area because we have other therapeutics that can help offset, and we are dedicated to early and late stage research and development. But again, we can't do it alone. There's a lot of failures in there. And so, we're staying in it because of all of those factors, but many other companies don't have the resilience we have and the risk reduction by having other therapeutics and to be able to stay in this business.
Yeah. In fact, we've seen an antibiotics company with an approved drug go out of business this year, and there may be more yet this year. Jeremy Knox, Policy and Advocacy Lead at the Wellcome Trust, which is one of the UK's largest science funders. This is a priority issue for Wellcome. You guys have done a lot of work both on supporting drug development, but also thinking about policy solutions and communicating about this, which we will come to later in the hour. But tell us how you look at the sort of ecosystem of drug development and your diagnosis of the problem and the challenges.
Sure. So we're really concerned by the scale of the problem here. Many people will know Wellcome as being a very well-established biomedical research funder. We have a history of more than 80 years or so in biomedical research. But for a problem like AMR, for a major global health problem of this kind of scale and of this scope, we've decided to take a very different approach and really approach this as a major program over 5 years where we're acting, as you say, both in the science space but also in the policy space. And really, although we recognise we need action on AMR on a number of fronts, on a very kind of broad waterfront, the thing that keeps us up at night and really kind of concerns us the most is the antibiotic pipeline and the ecosystem, the failures of the ecosystem that we're currently seeing. So back in 2016, we were one of the co-founding partners with the US government, with BARDA, of CARB-X, which is a major accelerator for preclinical and phase 1 antibiotic research. And that's been, I think, a great success in many respects over the past few years. And we're really excited by the way in which that has stimulated and supported a crop of very promising biotechs that have now a really good portfolio of products in early stage. But we're very concerned that with the kind of failed market as we see it, we have this valley of death emerging, whereby the companies who are doing the research at phase 1 have no ability to raise funds to go into phase 2 and phase 3. They can't find partnering opportunities with, or sell-out opportunities with major pharma. And so they have nowhere to go. There's a real possibility now that research that's been funded by philanthropy and by governments will die on the vine, and that it will just simply not reach patients. And that's unacceptable for us. So we've been very engaged with the policy debate, and I think there's now a very well-formed narrative around actually how we can fix this failed market, this idea that the market for antibiotics delivers low and unpredictable volumes and very, very low prices. And there have been ideas put forward to correct that, so-called pull incentives, so the idea of giving big, maybe lump sum or subscription-based payments to successful antibiotics. And I think we've seen a bit of political engagement in that in the UK, in the US. We've seen a kind of acceptance of a problem, but really beyond that, we see very little political engagement. So I think we're very concerned that although pull incentives are a kind of the right way to go, they could be a really transformative way that could kind of keep the taps of private investment on. Actually, we need to be thinking much more urgently around what are the other ways that we can make sure that products that are in early stage innovation can make it through and actually kind of make it all the way through to market. And that can't just be by having more and more public and philanthropic support going later and later into the pipeline. That's not sustainable, it's not affordable, it's not practical. So we need to think about how can we make later stage R&D an investable proposition again? How can we bring together public, private and philanthropic resources in new ways to make that happen and kind of get the ecosystem on a sustainable footing?
Well, and that's a great segue to Nick. So Nick Crabb is Program Director for Scientific Affairs at the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence, NICE, in the UK. There have been lots of calls for different kinds of economic models for antibiotic development, prizes and reimbursement reforms and so on. We can talk about these, but the UK is actually launching a fairly novel, a completely novel, subscription approach. So would you talk us a little bit about how this may work?
Yeah, sure. The UK 5-year National Action Plan for Antimicrobial Resistance that was published in January this year, and one of the commitments within what's a very broad-ranging set of policies is a commitment to testing solutions that will address the sort of the global failure to incentivize the development of new antimicrobials. So the current project, which is co-led by NICE, the institute I work for, and NHS England, who's the payer, the aim is to demonstrate the feasibility of innovative models that pay companies based on the sort of value of the antimicrobials to the NHS, rather than based on the volumes used. And the idea is that a health technology assessment undertaken by NICE will inform those sort of negotiations leading to hopefully mutually acceptable payment levels to companies, and those payment levels will be over a multi-year sort of period, you know, potentially with some review points during the sort of contract. Now that project builds on some sort of methods work, some health technology assessment methods work that was done last year. The work was sort of commissioned by the Department for Health and Social Care and NICE, and was undertaken by a group called the Economic Evaluation Policy Research Unit. Now their reports, you know, fully publicly available, and it's a really good piece of work. And the report essentially concluded that capturing the full value of antimicrobials across all the different attributes of value is really quite tricky. But at the same time, they considered there to be scope for a pragmatic HTA framework that you know, was informed by a combination of health economic modelling, but also making a great deal of use of sort of expert opinion. So based on that recommendation, we've moved into this the current project. And what's really important is that the health technology assessment can actually capture the value across all those different attributes of value. So not only the benefits that the individual patients who are actually treated with the antimicrobial get, but those additional benefits. So a new product may allow better sort of cycling stewardship regimes, for example, and a new product could actually slow down the rate of resistance to existing products. And sort of capturing that type of benefit in a health technology assessment framework is tricky, but our sort of colleagues from the Economic Policy Research Unit, you know, think that it's possible. So the way that we're actually developing this is initially through application to 2 products, and the idea is that the learning from that will inform the sort of forward policy on how to go about evaluating and purchasing antimicrobials. So just to say a little bit about the sort of progress, we formally launched the project in July this year. And the sort of progress so far has been that we've developed sort of draft documents covering the sort of, you know, the evaluation framework, the way we're going to go about evaluating the products. Because we're only starting with these 2 products, then we've put a lot of work into the sort of criteria and the process that will be used to select those 2 products for this work. And we also developed an outline sort of commercial model. And those documents went through a period of targeted engagement with our stakeholders, and we got some really insightful returns from that exercise, which were in the main pretty supportive of what we're trying to do. So I think there's a pretty decent consensus across our stakeholders. We're currently at the stage where we're working on the sort of detailed sort of process and timelines, and we plan to be saying more to our stakeholders in a webinar that's going to be happening quite late in November. So hopefully there'll be a bit more to report back on then. Just very quickly, because I'm probably well into my 2 to 3 minutes, but I thought it'd be good just to sort of just to very briefly outline what success would look like, and I think success would be from the direct projects would be that we'd successfully evaluated these 2 products, that those successful evaluations had led into successful commercial negotiations, such that there were actual sort of de-linked multi-year payment models in place for those 2 products. So I think that would be success from that sort of immediate project. But I think much more importantly, obviously, you know, England, UK, that's not big enough to solve this problem in any way. So what we're really looking to do as well is to sort of collaborate with people internationally and encourage the development of similar models that would work in their sort of territories, so that sort of collectively we can start developing meaningful pull incentives that would encourage investment in this area. And just really finally, obviously, I've been talking specifically about that one project, which is really all around pull incentives. But of course, making best use of what we already have is also a critical part of this overall AMR agenda. And NICE, other parts of NICE, so my various colleagues of mine are very active in supporting stewardship through a series of syndrome-specific antimicrobial prescribing guidelines. I'll stop there, Alan.
Wonderful, thank you. I have about 1 million questions, but let me get Mark Feinberg into this conversation. Mark's president and CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, which does not develop antibiotics. So you have a perspective on product development that's a little outside the antibiotics field, which I think is really valuable. So tell us a little bit about how you're thinking here.
Yeah, no thanks. So my background is a little unusual in that I had worked in my career in academia. I worked for a period of time for the US federal government. I worked for 12 years in the private sector, actually, at Merck on vaccines and infectious disease development efforts. And I now run a not-for-profit organization that's trying to address what is referred to as a market failure, which is really kind of the same issue that's relevant here, where whatever the normal forces that drive product development are not working. Either there's not a clear profit potential to get return on investment, or the scientific risk is too high. And so one of the things I've learned from working in those different settings is that those different sectors actually don't understand each other very well. They often have misperceptions about what the other's motives are or what the other's capabilities and limitations are. And to me, one reason why I left the private sector to work for a public sector not-for-profit organization was because I thought that there was tremendous capabilities to bring the public sector and the private sector together in new ways that would solve previously unsolved challenges by new models of collaboration. The other thing I learned that influences my thinking about this, and I'm sure Janelle and Jeremy and others on the panel will agree, is that product development isn't something that just happens with different components happening in isolation. It happens as part of really an integrated end-to-end approach, where you go all the way from discovery through development, through licensure, to policy, to procurement, and sustainable supply at whatever the affordable price is. And those things, people often fragment them and think that if you solve one aspect, you've solved the problem. And my perspective, and I've seen this either succeed or fail, is that unless you take on the challenge in totality, you are going to fail. And we've seen this with the Ecoagen example. They developed a product that addresses an important need, and they went out of business. So it's not that you can deal with these things in isolation. And there's been, as you know, a big debate between, do we need a public sector solution for this, which the private sector is very skeptical of, and the public sector thinks the private sector isn't committed, but they don't really understand, why it's hard for them to engage. And, while we at IAVI, we focus on addressing vaccines and monoclonal antibody therapeutics for diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, and emerging infectious diseases where there's not a good market for those preventive technologies. And I think while the science is amazing, what's also very promising is I think there are new opportunities to get people to work together in new ways. And what I would love to see in the AMR space is, rather than having all these separate discussions where different people are kind of talking at each other, if there's an opportunity for people to come together and try to co-create a solution about what would work and how do we integrate across the product development continuum so we can bring the best science to bear on this problem, but also have it have a reasonable probability of success, of successfully navigating down the development path where it's actually benefiting people who need it. And I'm concerned that if we don't figure that out, then we will continue to have panel discussions like this for many years into the future, and that will be a tragedy.
So thanks for that. So let's explore that a little. There are at least two ideas on the table here, and they're intertwined. But One is, how do we change policy to make the market work for traditional drug developers? And I put traditional in quotes because the antibiotic business has already begun to become quite braided with push funding from BARDA, US government, push funding from Carbex and other sources on the front. And we've already made some policy tweaks to try and encourage developers to stay in. So it's far from a completely sort of laissez-faire market. But so one conversation is, nevertheless, how do we change the sort of revenue proposition for antibiotics? The other is, how do we work in different ways to sort of find synergies within the scientific enterprise, hand stuff off in an appropriate way? So let's stay with that one for a minute. So Mark, from your perspective, what would you look for? What would you create to try and sort of rejuvenate and create more efficiency in the R&D enterprise to bring products through the pipeline?
Yeah. No, I'm not sure that I have the answer to that, and I actually specifically don't want to propose an answer, because I think that needs to come out of a dialogue between the different stakeholders. So one of my jobs, well, a significant part of my job at Merck was dealing with global health issues, either diseases of developing countries or challenges like the Ebola vaccine program, which is not something that would normally get any interest on the part of a company. There's no profit potential there, but as Janelle indicated, companies do want to address public health needs. They just need a viable pathway to do it. And so engaging, but there were things that the company could do and things that the public sector could do, and then there were things that each of them couldn't do, and we ended up finding ways of complementing that. And I think here, understanding what can the private sector contribute. Obviously, they have the experience in drug development leading to licensure, and that's a critically important skill. How do we engage their expertise in a way that is not an unrealistic burden on them, and that takes advantage of their capabilities and finds ways of complementing it? And I kind of think just even a serious, focused convening with sufficient momentum around it to bring people together to say, what would work for all of us to deliver the products we need based on what we know about product development, public health, and the needs of patients who are waiting for better therapies. So rather than presuppose a solution, I really think having a concerted, focused effort to try to create that model by bringing the different stakeholders together and finding some way of holding them accountable and making sure that it's not like a one-off discussion, but there's actually a viable process that people can buy into.
Well, let me invite other panelists to jump in on this, especially Janelle and Jeremy, because you have both thought about it. But let me also put out there have been fairly high-profile calls recently to say, look, let's just forget the pharma model. It's clearly not working. We need a nonprofit entity that's going to be the future of antibiotic discovery and development. So let's put that out there. What do you think about that? And if not that, then what?
Yeah, so I think to start with that one, I think there's been a very interesting discussion. It's good to have a debate around things, around a full spectrum of options. I think from our perspective, we can see there is kind of a superficial attractiveness to the idea of some sort of kind of public champion, some sort of, I guess, quote unquote, nationalized model. But I think ultimately that's not going to deliver what we need. I think we are very clear that there is real huge innovative potential in the private sector, particularly in SMEs at the moment. And I think if we go down a route where we say, well, let's remove any kind of private profit, any kind of private return on investment and risk, then you may be able to kind of nurture a small crop of antibiotics through the pipeline, but really you're going to kill the bit of ecosystem that's working really well at the moment. So I think we do need to carry on thinking about really how can we sustain private engagement in the pipeline in the longer term. I think to look at what other options do work, I think there is a growing appetite to talk about models which genuinely do think about doing things differently. There are kind of the incremental levers that we can start pulling and start looking at, which look at things like the regulatory environment, the kind of work that Nick has described to find ways to define a rational value for antibiotics, which does recognize their value to society. That, I think, is really important. Things like clinical trial networks to kind of bring the costs down of doing late-stage trials, they're all important. But I think there are more fundamental things we can explore, which are genuinely around kind of pooling of risk, sharing of risk between different actors, and finding ways to say, okay, well, how can we make sure that the products that are currently in early stage innovation in smaller companies how can they either get access to the resources that Big Pharma has and kind of the scalability, the commercialization resources that Big Pharma has, or how can we create kind of vehicles which mean that they don't need to rely on Big Pharma to be their partners or to be their source of the buyout. So I think trying to think about how we can do that, and then how can we finance that in a way which doesn't depend solely on public or philanthropic money. We should be able to find ways to kind of bring the risk down, make this an investable proposition again, and by doing so, make sure that we can kind of keep private investment flowing in where it's really needed, which is the late stage for commercialization. I think the Acagian story shows that although it's kind of nice to picture a model where you could have a small company going all the way from preclinical all the way through to phase 3 to commercialization onto a global market, that's not necessarily realistic, and it's probably not efficient. So really, how can we make sure that where we have limited resources, where we have such a challenging market, how can we make life as easy as possible for the most promising assets coming out of early stage?
Yeah, a lot of the innovation in the pipeline, a lot of the products that are in the pipeline now are coming from small companies that are completely pre-revenue. It's not sort of big pharma. And historically, those companies would get a product to a certain stage, and then it would be acquired by a big pharma that already had a sales force and a marketing team and so on. And one of the places the small companies are running into trouble right now is it's really expensive if you're trying to take that product all the way to market and build your sales force and so on. So Janelle, from a big pharma perspective, when you look at drugs coming through the pipeline, what will it take to get big pharma back in acquiring some of those late stage products?
Absolutely. But can I also back it up just a little bit?
Absolutely.
And I'll put on my previous hat, where I used to be the health policy director of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee here in the United States Senate. And that is where we passed some of the first push incentives. And this was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago. And we had the GAIN Act and things like that. And so I do want to make sure we are at a point of a public health crisis, and we need action now. There's no question. But I do want to make sure we're not just all pessimistic here. As we were talking about with Carbex and with BARDA, you look at how we put money in on that push incentives, and with GAIN Act giving some more regulatory easement, and lately with LPAD passing for limited populations, we really have put out there a bunch of new companies, and VCs and pre-revenue companies started doing research, and that was excellent. That's exactly what we wanted. But we learned, as Jeremy said, then there was this valley of death. We didn't know that back then, but I don't want it to get lost that governments acted. They reacted to a problem and they tried something. And in some ways, it worked, but it also uncovered, as we know, that this is a much more complex problem. And so now, as we're looking at how, and as Dr. Feinberg said, as we look at how do we look at the continuum here, we're now seeing we have to look at this all together. And I totally agree with what Jeremy said, that unfortunately, this is not going to be a silver bullet. I think we all know, as policy geeks up here and in the audience, that anytime there's really difficult things, it's many times many changes that have to happen, and they happen in that sweet spot. It's never on either ends here. And so I think, Allan, to your question, now when you're asking, how do we get through that valley of death? And because you're exactly right, all of our big pharma companies have a business development department, right? They're out there looking, what assets should we buy? What's there, right? There is, some issues where, what are the good signals? Because it isn't, let's be clear, it's not just the commercialization. Many times we buy it and we have to take it on to late stage. We do a lot of clinical development here, and we do the late stage, getting it through, and then the commercialization. But what looks promising, and I think that comes to the foundational problem of the return on investment with the reimbursement systems. And how can you do the proper stewardship, which means when we come up with this drug, and even you do the BD, the business development, and you come with that drug, you don't want anyone to use it. That's a crazy model, isn't it? You say, please do not use it until you need it. So that brings up, as we were talking about, so important, the stewardship. We also need to really develop the rapid, fast diagnostic testing. I know we, through our smart surveillance studies, we have partnered with diagnostic companies to give them all of the data so we can find the right drug at the right time. And that also may help hospitals and the payment system be able to give the patients access to the right drug at the right time. So I think it's going to take continued push investments and working on with the public sector, but then also all the ways through that there's going to be a reimbursement, the proper reimbursement for these novel antibiotics.
So let's come in a moment to questions of reimbursement and some of the other market incentives that have been proposed. But let me just first quickly come back to Ella and to Nick. Ellie, I want to be careful not to put you on the spot. You don't work for the CF Foundation, but the CF Foundation actually is a nonprofit that has had a lot of experience driving drug development. So give us your perspective there.
That's right. So the CF Foundation has just created the Infection Research Initiative. And so they've committed $100 million to infection research over the next 5 years. And so in the pipeline already, they have some novel therapy approaches like nitric oxide. So there's an inhaled therapy alternative to antibiotics that can be used in synergy with traditional antibiotics. And so I think they're really exploring how different avenues of approaching infections, and they're partnering with smaller therapeutic companies to create these therapies.
Great. Now, Nick, the UK subscription model, am I correct in understanding then that the expectation is companies will still sell drugs at a unit price and derive revenue based on unit sales, but that will be plussed up with some payment based on a model of the value to society of that drug? Is that a fair?
You're slightly ahead of where we are. And that sort of detail hasn't really been worked through yet. But I think there will be some sort of price at the point of transaction, simply to to keep existing supply chains sort of working. So I think your summary is probably likely to be the way things play out. What's really important, I think, is that that transaction cost is at a point where the prescribing decision is based purely on the clinical needs of the patient in front of the prescriber and minimizing AMR. So those details around the payment system are going to be critically important, but I think that that's the prime aim, is to make sure that because I think we talk a lot about drugs that require very, very heavy stewardship, where we hope to not have to use them, and models that will make it attractive to develop those products. But there's also other products where they have diversity value, where they can by using them more, it can reduce the emergence of resistance to existing antimicrobials. So in those cases, we actually need payment models that encourage use. So I think the really key thing is we get to a point where it's the patient need and minimizing AMR are the only thoughts going through the mind of the sort of prescriber or the prescribing team.
And what can you say about the interest to date from companies? Are they lining up to negotiate here, or how's it playing out?
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of interest and a huge amount of support, and I should be really clear that the industry was pivotal in sort of coming up with this. So there's been a government industry AMR sort of strategy group in place for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, and there's been a subgroup of that's been really focused on these sort of reimbursement models. The work that led up to the methods work that I described earlier, and then that's led up to the current project, industry's been very much a partner all the way through.
Great. So we're going to come to the audience in just a moment for questions, but I do want to come back to this question of policy incentives for development. Jeremy, Wellcome has funded quite a bit of work here, including some in the US, looking at potential policy solutions to make that market work. Janelle, Merck is also engaged in these conversations. What do you see as the thing that would be most likely to sort of solve this problem and create a viable market?
So I think, building on a point Janelle made earlier, I think there is no single answer here, and I think we are concerned by the overall progress on a global scale with the policy response. I mean, I think we, as I said, we do still see progress of pull incentives, so new reimbursement models that deliver kind of some sort of kind of substitute, some sort of major incentive. I think that will still be very attractive and should be our long-term goal here. But I think in the short to medium term, we also need to be thinking about, well, really, how can we catalyze progress towards that, and how can we think about ways that we can provide a route to market for things that otherwise might fail in kind of early to mid-stage. So how can we make sure that the most promising products coming out of phase 1, coming out of CARB-X support, don't simply, like we said, enter the valley of death because they can't raise financing. So I think there's a real need to kind of think about that. I think what I would say is that we operate globally and we talk a lot. I mean, we spend a lot of time in the UK and the US, but we speak much more widely than that. And I think the kind of slightly concerning point is that we've heard about what the US has been doing already, and the US by far and away is still the biggest government funder of antibiotic R&D through BARDA, through NIH, through other things. And the UK as well has really led by example, and there's been real political commitments behind efforts to think about how the NHS can procure antibiotics differently, how the UK can use its leadership on the global stage. But really, it's very concerning to see a lack of political engagement beyond the US and the UK. It's still so often just these two countries that are really kind of out there amongst the ahead of the others, and I think trying to broaden it and trying to find a way to get a broader set of countries, kind of a wider G20 for instance even to start with, to get them to engage with a conversation on terms that they're prepared to about actually how can we really make sure that globally we're stimulating the pipeline rather than just relying on isolated action between Washington and London.
Mark, what's your perspective, having been in the space of creating products for huge demand in low-income countries with limited ability to pay? Jeremy's describing the UK and the US sort of stepping up. Is that just the way it has to be, or how should we think about that?
No, I mean, going back to my earlier comments, I do think that the critical expertise resides in the private sector, and yet it's the public sector who has a deep understanding of what the unmet medical need is, as well as, you know, a public health responsibility to take care of their populations and an insight about how that works. And you know, figuring out how to line that up is very important. You know, having worked in a large multinational pharmaceutical company, at least the one that I worked for, didn't seem at all interested in these kind of incentives that people put out there, because if it's not your core business, it's really a distraction, and the amount of incentive that people can put forward is not all that compelling when the pharma companies think about everything that would need to happen in order to deliver a product. So I think, you know, understanding, you know, again, what it would take to allow contributions of each sector along the development continuum, I think there's a lot of promise there, and I think in isolation, it's not going to happen. You know, there's been a lot of progress made in developing innovations against global health threats, whether it's, you know, HIV treatments. You know, recently we, you know, published yesterday with GSK the results of a TB vaccine study, which, you know, for the first time in 100 years, we have a new TB vaccine that has demonstrated efficacy, which is kind of pretty impressive. But that only happened by, you know, combining public sector and private sector engagement. And I think there's tremendous opportunity to do that here as well. But I think everybody needs to have a better understanding of each sector's commitment and capabilities and limitations.
Janelle?
You know, I have to say Japan, and another avenue we could really harness. I know in 2016, when they were the presidency of the G7, they put this on the agenda. Now we have the G20 coming in 2019. this is looking to be on the agenda, this issue. I think this is another, I mean, as we know, microbial resistance, it has no borders, right? Like, this is a global issue. But as Jeremy was saying, there is a lot of talk, and it's great. As a trained psychologist, I know awareness is the first stage, right, of solving our problem. But we really do need to act, and I don't know if we need to use some of those other levers as you have a wide range of stakeholders to really move this up on the political agenda. And as I agree with Mark and Jeremy, I do think, you know, we need to put our shoulders behind all the push incentives and everything all the way through the continuum. What I worry about is we don't have a lot of time to fix this reimbursement problem. Going back to Allan, what you said earlier, companies are not putting capital into this area because there is not a return there that's fixing the market failure. And so if you continue on the push, the earlier side, you eventually may not have the bigger farmers to ever, and unfortunately then you're going more to a public phenomenon.
And if I could add to that, I mean, once a company gets out of a given therapeutic area, they're not going to get back into it. And once they get out of that therapeutic area, their scientific expertise and, you know, historical knowledge goes away as well. So, you know, I agree with Janelle that we have a short window to act, and in many ways it's already late, which isn't to sound doom and gloom, it's just say we need to sort of have a focused commitment to solving this problem.
At Pew, we wrote a report a few years ago on barriers to antibiotic discovery and drew on scientists from many, many companies, almost all of whom have since either their companies have folded or they've moved on to other therapeutic areas or they've retired. I mean, it's really been dramatic. I want to come back to the awareness point that Janelle raised, but let's first go, do we have questions in the audience? I have a couple questions in the back, please. There's microphones, and please just introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is John Rigg. I'm with the Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This is a fascinating discussion, and it's good to know that there's a lot of work underway with regards to incentives. It definitely represents a clear collective action problem, but I'm wondering if we're not also thinking about the next collective action problem, which is after we have new forms of antibiotics, how do we deal with stewardship, especially in a multilateral global setting where delivery systems vary in terms of their capacity and their sophistication? Do you have any thoughts about that? Or are we just sort of setting ourselves up for the next big, hairy problem?
So it's a great question. I'm going to put it to the panel, but let me first credit your department for just a couple of weeks ago putting out a new reg that will require every hospital to have an antibiotic stewardship program in order to get paid by Medicare, which is a really great step, but doesn't get to that whole universe of stewardship that you asked about. So panelists have thoughts there.
I have to say, this goes hand in hand. You can't fix the reimbursement system and not have a strong stewardship program. You also, I think to my point earlier, we need to develop the diagnostics so that we're quickly knowing what is the right drug to use at the right time. Because right now, many times we're putting on people on these broad spectrum drugs, and they really shouldn't be on these drugs for so long, but it's taking so long for the panels to change, for the hospitals to know what drug to give them. I think secondly, it's really important. We've had a lack of clinical guidelines being updated. They need to be updated. We have to have the right labels in our drugs. All of this has to go hand in hand, because I agree, it is not in our interest as a developer of antibiotics for them to be misused, because we also know as soon as you start using our drug, resistance is starting. So like, that's not hence a market failure. But that, I mean, that's critical and cannot be divorced from this discussion in our eyes.
Anyone else want to jump in on this question of stewardship?
I mean, I think we get very worried from the low middle income country angle. So obviously that's a huge, often unmet demand. So I think we kind of think, well really there is a bit of an emerging conversation going on around, well, really what in practical terms does it mean to improve access and to improve stewardship? in these sorts of settings, very resource-constrained settings where there may be all sorts of barriers to access, both from a country level down to the kind of the patient and the caregiver level. I think we're having a bit of a discussion emerging around the role of industry in that and the role of governments, but there's still like a missing third part, which is in the absence of kind of big vertical programs like we have in TB and HIV, in the absence of something like the Global Fund, what is that missing piece that still needs to be filled? So it's beginning to be tackled, but we're a long way from having answers on that front.
And I guess if I could just add one thing. I mean, historically people have thought about antibacterial treatment or antimicrobial treatment as like a medical problem, and it's really now a public health problem, and we're not treating it like a public health problem. So the way you think about policy for vaccines is very different from the way you think about policy for drugs. And I think the vaccine example, where you have clear policy guidelines about how vaccines should be used, which populations, what ages, and that really drives reimbursement and public sector procurement in many cases in a profound way. And for a pharma company, their vaccine program either lives or dies based on getting favorable policy recommendations, because that drives medical practice. And that's not the model here. And I think there's a lot of things that could be learned from that.
And let me acknowledge in passing that there are some vaccines in development for AMR-related pathogens. Not much on the market yet, and that non-traditional sort of approach to therapeutics and preventing resistant infections is still very much in its infancy. Were you? No. So I know we had a question here, and we have one in the back. I'm not sure where the microphone is. So I'll go to Robert.
Just maybe two quick things. First off, we've talked a lot about the conversations and how long we've been having conversations about fixing this. We've also talked about the need to act. I think it is important to note that policymakers within both the administration and Congress right now are starting to put thoughts behind those words. I think ultimately their ability to come forward and their success in part is predicated on absence or access to resources. And then second thing is overcoming, and I think political will to do it. What I'm just curious a little bit is from our international partners or those, let's say, that talk to other countries, what opportunities are there, I think, today for other countries or maybe private organizations to help the U.S. move forward, understanding that resources might be a big part of their success or failure in doing so?
And Robert, just introduce yourself.
Sorry, Robert Horn, Levitt Partners.
Great.
Thanks.
So question to the panel there, and let me add on to that. What about drug pricing? This seems like an inopportune time to be trying to get more money for pharmaceutical companies. So how do you think about this, both that question and how this plays in an environment of concern about overall drug spending? Janelle?
Oh, I didn't know if you were asking a government official. No, this is complex, and that is why we are needing to partner with everyone, infectious disease docs and public health docs. I think, the public and many policymakers understand that doing antibiotic research and development and bringing out these novel antibiotics is not the lucrative return on investment. So this is not where you go for your drug pricing issues. So I think, it takes educating, but it also is, policymakers and their teams around them need to really understand the difference in this therapeutic, how the market failure works, and that there isn't a return on investment. And this is why companies aren't doing this. But it's tricky, no question, and that is why, the infectious disease docs have been in the front lines of this, especially the ones that were dealing with AIDS in the early years, and they had no drugs to help those patients dealing with AIDS. They're the ones to be able to really explain, this is different, and we're approaching that time.
Great. We've got 5 minutes left, less than that. I'm going to take one last question here, and then we'll come back to the panelists for a lightning round of final comments. Real quick, we'll ask them together.
Yeah, the misuse of antibiotics is not peculiar to this country. There's more than a few countries around the world where you walk into a pharmacy and they will sell you pills by the unit. You get behind the counter and you get an injectable. A good chunk of that may be counterfeit product with zero, active ingredient in it, and it just promotes, as we all know, quick resistance. And if resistance emerges somewhere in the world, it it will be no time before it's here. You know, how do we get our arms around this?
We got it. Other question in the back?
Yeah, I think another approach is to target the host and find ways that avoid antibiotic resistance because you're targeting the host. But it's interesting because the GAIN Act and QIDP excludes any of that kind of therapy. So is there any move to broaden what's defined as something that's combating antimicrobial resistance?
So we got two questions there. Let me say that our focus for the panel is really product development and not stewardship. Incredibly important. We're going to table that one for now. But that's a good quick segue to the question of how do we stimulate the development of something other than small molecule therapeutics for bacterial infections. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, give the whole panel a chance to share thoughts on that and also any kind of wrap-up thoughts. I'm going to start with Ella and Jeremy. We also promised to get to work that Welcome has just done on how to talk effectively about this issue. So actually, let's do that first.
Sure. So I think so. Yeah, I think one of the kind of key things we see is that one of the challenges with political action on this and kind of political risk-taking on this, not just in the US but globally, is that there isn't really kind of a sense of there being a public outrage, a real public demand for action. We have some notable patient voices, but still where we have had action, it's been because politicians have bought in, they've been persuaded privately rather than feeling like this is a voter issue. We at Welcome, we've just yesterday published a major piece of work. It's the biggest piece of consumer research, of communications research ever undertaken in AMR that looks at really kind of global misconceptions and global perceptions about antibiotic resistance and how to communicate it better. And what's really clear from that is there are some real kind of universal misunderstandings in all parts of the world around the challenges of antibiotic resistance and what it means. To talk about it, we need to make sure we're kind of getting away from the jargon, talking much more about the kind of the consequences in the here and now, how it can affect people, how it can affect their families right here today, rather than talking in the abstract about what will happen in 2050 when 10 million people will die. That's really kind of turning the public off. All sorts of kind of tips in the report, so I'd encourage you to read it, but basically the kind of, in a nutshell, if we can communicate better, we can get the public to believe they should be calling for action, that makes the political piece a whole lot easier.
It's a today problem, not a tomorrow problem.
Precisely.
Last thoughts, Janelle?
Just that, you know, I think you all have heard this is, and no, it's a very complex issue, and that I think as a group, we need to come together and we need to come up with multiple solutions to this problem and be able to really put our shoulder behind it and work this on a global level and get the right solutions throughout the continuum.
Great.
Thank
Mark?
Yeah, no, the question that was, the last question that was asked about, you know, new opportunities. I mean, I think there's so much, you know, power in contemporary science and emerging technologies, and, you know, applying that to this problem would, I think, create new opportunities to address the issue. But the only way that's going to happen if people see a viable path from idea to product, and if you know, there's adequate resources available to enable scientists in academia and government laboratories to focus attention on applying the new technologies to this problem. And right now, you know, given the magnitude of the public health crisis, I don't think that there's necessarily adequate resources devoted to it. I mean, tremendous progress has been made in AIDS, but that's because so much money was you know, allocated to the research and development efforts, and a lot of that was driven, as you know, Jeremy knows, by you know, public engagement and advocacy. So having public engagement and advocacy in this space, I think, will also be very beneficial.
Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Just one sort of final thought from me. We haven't talked about this in the panel yet, but I think I'm wondering if there's scope for capturing the indirect interests of the pharmaceutical industry. So I mean, if you look at the pipeline of immuno-oncology agents, for example, it's an incredibly active area. But of course, quite a lot of those products, you know, don't actually work if you don't have adequate antibiotic coverage. So I'm just wondering if there's some way of capturing that sort of indirect interest.
Ella?
As a patient with a great amount of need for new antimicrobials, you know, I urge policymakers and pharmaceutical companies to really work together to create solutions, because, as we all say, we need them now.
And as you've heard, your voice is so important in driving this conversation forward.
you.
Great conversation, wide-ranging and clearly one that needs to continue. But join me in thanking the panel.